The relationship between defense procurement and political reliability has entered a new phase of scrutiny in Canada. In early 2025, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney ordered a comprehensive review of Canada's commitment to purchase 88 F-35 Lightning II fighter jets from Lockheed Martin, a deal valued at approximately $27.7 billion Canadian dollars. This review was initiated against the backdrop of escalating trade tensions between Canada and the United States, including the implementation of tariffs on Canadian exports by the Trump administration. Canada has confirmed its commitment to the first 16 aircraft already in production, but the decision regarding the remaining 72 jets remains under active reassessment. The significance of this review extends beyond a single procurement decision, raising fundamental questions about the relationship between defense cooperation, technological sovereignty, and the stability of alliance partnerships when economic pressure becomes part of bilateral relations. This analysis examines the Canadian F-35 reassessment through three interconnected dimensions. First, we will establish the confirmed facts regarding Canada's procurement decision, the political context of the review, and the stated positions of relevant parties. Second, we will contextualize this situation within the broader framework of defense procurement practices, the technical characteristics of modern fighter aircraft, and the historical relationship between Canada and the United States on defense matters. Third, we will assess the strategic implications of this reassessment for NATO interoperability, alliance cohesion, and the emerging question of technological sovereignty in military systems. The confirmed facts begin with Canada's original commitment in January 2023 to purchase 88 F-35A Lightning II aircraft to replace the Royal Canadian Air Force's aging CF-18 Hornet fleet. This decision followed a competitive procurement process in which the F-35 prevailed over Sweden's Swedish Gripen, the only other finalist. The procurement timeline called for the first aircraft to be delivered to Luke Air Force Base in Arizona in 2026 for pilot training, with the first aircraft arriving in Canada in 2028. The Royal Canadian Air Force has already begun infrastructure preparations at Cold Lake and Bagotville air bases to accommodate F-35 operations, including security upgrades and specialized facilities for handling the aircraft's mission data systems. In March 2025, following his election as Prime Minister, Mark Carney ordered a review of the F-35 procurement. According to official statements, this review was prompted by diplomatic tensions with the United States under President Donald Trump's administration. The Trump administration had implemented tariffs on Canadian exports beginning in February 2025, with rates reaching 25% on most Canadian goods except energy, which faced a 10% tariff. These tariffs were raised to 35% in August 2025. In January 2026, President Trump threatened to impose a 50% tariff on Canadian aircraft and announced plans to decertify all aircraft built in Canada. These actions created a political environment in which Canadian officials began questioning the reliability of the United States as a defense supplier and economic partner. As of February 2026, Canada has confirmed it will proceed with the purchase of the first 16 F-35 aircraft already in production. Canadian Defense Procurement Secretary Stephen Four stated in October 2025 that the government has no plans to exit the existing contract for these aircraft. However, the decision regarding the remaining 72 aircraft remains under review. Canadian Industry Minister Melanie Joly has publicly stated that the government is exploring options to maximize economic benefits from defense spending and has acknowledged ongoing discussions with Saab regarding the Gripen fighter. Saab has offered to establish manufacturing capacity in Canada that would create approximately 12,600 aerospace jobs and provide greater local industrial participation than the F-35 program structure allows. U.S. Ambassador to Canada Pete Hoekstra stated in January 2026 that if Canada does not proceed with the full F-35 purchase, adjustments to NORAD, the Joint North American Aerospace Defense Command, would be necessary. Hoekstra indicated that the United States would need to increase its fighter presence to address capability gaps and suggested that choosing a platform with less interoperability could complicate defense planning. Canadian officials have emphasized that Canada remains committed to NORAD and to acquiring the capabilities necessary to defend Canadian airspace, but have not provided a timeline for a final decision on the remaining 72 aircraft. The context for understanding this situation requires examining several structural factors. Canada and the United States have maintained close defense cooperation for over 8 decades. Formalized through NORAD since 1958 and through NATO since Canada's founding membership in 1949, this cooperation has historically included shared early warning systems, integrated air defense, and high levels of military interoperability. Defense procurement decisions have traditionally reflected this close relationship, with Canadian forces often operating U.S.-manufactured equipment to facilitate joint operations and logistical integration. The F-35 program represents a multinational development effort in which Canada has participated since 1997. Canada contributed $150 million to the system development phase and became a Level 3 partner in the program alongside Norway, Denmark, Turkey, and Australia. This participation has allowed Canadian aerospace companies to compete for contracts related to F-35 production and sustainment. According to program data, over 110 Canadian companies have received contracts worth approximately $3.3 billion United States dollars for F-35 related work, with each F-35 containing approximately $3.2 million CAD worth of Canadian-made components. The program's industrial participation structure was designed to provide economic returns to partner nations that contributed to development costs and committed to purchasing the aircraft. The F-35 is a fifth-generation multi-role fighter characterized by stealth capabilities, advanced sensor fusion, and networked warfare systems. The aircraft's operational effectiveness depends heavily on software systems that manage sensor data, mission planning, targeting, and communications. These software systems, including the Autonomic Logistics Information System that manages maintenance and the mission data files that enable the aircraft to operate in specific threat environments, are controlled and updated by the United States through the F-35 Joint Program Office. Operating nations receive access to these systems, but do not have independent authority to modify core software or manage updates without U.S. approval. This structure differs from previous fighter aircraft programs where purchasing nations often had greater autonomy over modifications and system updates. The current reassessment reflects a collision between traditional defense cooperation patterns and contemporary political tensions. The Trump administration's use of tariffs as a foreign policy tool has introduced economic pressure into a relationship previously characterized by security cooperation and economic integration. From Canada's perspective, tariffs targeting major export sectors including steel, aluminum, lumber, and automotive products have created direct economic costs. The threat of additional tariffs on aircraft, including potential tariffs on Canadian aerospace exports, has added a layer of uncertainty to the defense procurement decision. This creates a situation where a major defense purchase from a supplier that is simultaneously implementing punitive trade measures raises questions about the wisdom of deepening dependency on that supplier. The issue of software control has emerged as a focal point in discussions about the F-35 purchase. Modern military aircraft are fundamentally software-dependent systems. The F-35 operates using millions of lines of code that control everything from basic flight systems to weapons employment and threat response. The mission data files that allow the F-35 to operate effectively in combat are developed and maintained by the United States and allied reprogramming laboratories. While Canada gained formal integration into the Australia-Canada-United Kingdom Reprogramming Laboratory in October 2024, giving Canadian personnel access to mission data development, final authority over software updates and system modifications remains with the U.S.-led Joint Program Office. This creates a structural dependency that differs from previous procurement decisions. With earlier generation aircraft, purchasing nations typically had greater ability to independently maintain, modify, and operate their aircraft without ongoing dependency on the manufacturer or original supplier nation. The F-35's architecture requires continuous connection to USAS-controlled systems for updates, maintenance diagnostics, and operational planning support. This architecture was designed to provide common standards across the multinational F-35 fleet and to enable rapid updates across all operators simultaneously. However, it also means that operating nations must maintain cooperative relationships with the United States to ensure their aircraft remain operationally effective. The sovereignty concern centers on what happens if political relations between supplier and purchaser deteriorate significantly. While there is no evidence of the United States ever using software access as a coercive tool against F-35 partner nations, the theoretical possibility exists. If access to updates or mission data were restricted, the operational effectiveness of 35 fleets could be degraded. This concern has been raised in public discussions by Canadian parliamentarians and defense analysts, though neither the Canadian government nor Lockheed Martin has indicated that such restrictions are likely or that mechanisms exist to prevent them. The Gripen alternative presents a different technological and industrial model. Sweden's Saab offers the JAS-39 Gripen E, which is designed for greater operational independence and lower lifecycle costs. The Gripen uses an open architecture system that allows greater operator control over software and modifications. Sweden, as a traditionally neutral nation that is only recently joining NATO, designed the Gripen to operate without dependency on external support networks. The aircraft is designed for road-based operations, rapid maintenance, and high availability rates with lower support requirements than larger fifth-generation fighters. Saab's proposal to Canada includes local production arrangements that would provide Canadian industry with greater work share than the F-35 SUS multinational production structure allows. However, the Gripen represents different capabilities than the F-35. The Gripen E is a fourth-generation plus fighter with reduced radar, cross-section features but not the comprehensive stealth characteristics of the F-35. It lacks the F-35's advanced sensor fusion and the networked warfare capabilities that allow multiple F-35s to share targeting data and operate as an integrated system. The Gripen's operational radius and payload capacity are lower than the F-35's, which affects its suitability for certain mission profiles including long-range air superiority and strike operations. Advocates of the Gripen argue these limitations are acceptable given Canada's defensive mission requirements, and that the aircraft's availability and sovereignty advantages outweigh capability differences. Critics argue that selecting a less capable platform would reduce Canada's ability to operate with US and NATO forces and would leave capability gaps that could affect NORAD operations. The political context includes domestic Canadian dynamics that extend beyond the bilateral relationship with the United States. The F-35 procurement has been politically contentious in Canada for over a decade. The Conservative government under Prime Minister Stephen Harper first announced plans to purchase F-35s in 2010. But the decision was challenged by opposition parties and ultimately shelved following criticism from the Parliamentary Budget Officer and Auditor General regarding cost, projections, and the adequacy of the competitive process. The Liberal government under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau initially campaigned on a promise not to buy the F-35, but after conducting a new competitive process, the F-35 again emerged as the winner in 2022, leading to the 2023 contract signing. The current review under Prime Minister Mark Carney reflects both the specific tensions with the Trump administration and broader questions about Canada's strategic positioning. Carney's government was elected in part on a platform of reducing Canadian economic vulnerability to U.S. policy decisions and strengthening relationships with other partners. The decision to pursue a trade agreement with China in early 2026, despite U.S. objections and threats of 100% tariffs if Canada proceeded, reflects this strategic orientation. The F-35 review fits within this broader pattern of reassessing relationships and dependencies that had previously been taken for granted. The NATO interoperability consideration is significant, but its weight is disputed. Supporters of completing the F-35 purchase emphasize that the aircraft has become the standard fighter for most NATO members. The United States, United Kingdom, Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, Belgium, Poland, Germany, Switzerland, and other allies either operate or have committed to purchasing F-35s. Operating common platforms facilitates joint training, simplified logistics, and shared tactics. NATO operations increasingly assume that participating nations will have compatible communication systems and sensor networks, capabilities that the F-35 is designed to provide. From this perspective, choosing a different platform could reduce Canada's ability to integrate seamlessly with allied operations. However, NATO operates with a diverse mix of aircraft types, and interoperability standards exist to enable cooperation between different platforms. Sweden's Gripen is already operated by Sweden, a NATO member, and by Czech Republic, which is also procuring the aircraft. NATO has established data link standards and operational procedures that allow different aircraft types to work together, though the level of integration is not as seamless as operating identical platforms. The question becomes whether the reduced interoperability of operating Gripen instead of F-35 is significant enough to outweigh other considerations including cost, industrial benefits, and sovereignty concerns. The United States' response to Canada's reassessment has included both diplomatic pressure and warnings about operational consequences. Ambassador Hoekstra's January 2026 statements about the need to adjust NORAD if Canada does not complete the F-35 purchase represent an effort to emphasize the stakes involved. The implication is that US-Canada defense cooperation, which has been remarkably stable across different administrations and political parties in both countries, could be affected if Canada proceeds with a major procurement decision that the United States views as reducing interoperability and alliance cohesion. However, these statements also risk reinforcing the Canadian perception that the United States treats Canada as a subordinate rather than as a sovereign partner, which could strengthen political support within Canada for pursuing alternatives. The timeline for a final decision remains uncertain. Canada continues infrastructure preparation work at Cold Lake and Begoville that is specifically designed for F-35 operations, suggesting that the government is preserving the option to proceed with the full purchase. Canadian pilots are scheduled to begin training on F-35s at Luke Air Force Base in 2026, which requires the continuation of existing arrangements. At the same time, the government has not foreclosed the possibility of a mixed fleet with some F-35s and some Gripen aircraft or a decision to cap F-35 purchases at 16 and acquire a different platform for the remaining requirement. Industry Minister Jolie's public statements about ongoing discussions with Saab indicate that alternatives remain under active consideration. The economic dimension includes not only the procurement cost, but also the broader question of industrial participation and economic returns. The F-35 program's structure provides Canadian companies with opportunities to compete for contracts across the entire global F-35 fleet, not just for Canadian aircraft. However, these opportunities depend on Canadian companies winning contracts in competition with suppliers from other partner nations. The total value of contracts awarded to Canadian industry is substantial at over $3.3 billion USD. But this represents work that has been secured through competitive bidding rather than guaranteed workshare tied directly to Canadian purchases. Saab's proposal offers guaranteed workshare tied to Canadian procurement, with local assembly and manufacturing creating direct employment in Canada. The company has proposed that components representing a high percentage of each aircraft's value would be manufactured in Canada, providing more predictable industrial benefits than the F-35's competitive model. However, this would require establishing new production capacity and supply chains, which involves upfront investment and execution risk. The question for policymakers is whether guaranteed but more limited workshare tied to a smaller fleet is preferable to competitive opportunities across a much larger global program. Given the factors outlined above, three plausible scenarios emerge for how Canada's F-35 reassessment could conclude. The first scenario involves Canada proceeding with the full 88 aircraft F-35 purchase as originally planned. Conditions required for this outcome include political calculation that the diplomatic and operational benefits of maintaining the F-35 commitment outweigh the concerns about U.S. reliability and sovereignty. This could occur if the trade tensions with the United States moderate, if the Canadian government concludes that the capability and interoperability advantages are decisive, or if domestic political pressure to maintain alliance commitments becomes dominant. Early indicators would include Canadian officials making public statements reaffirming the full commitment continued progression of infrastructure work at F-35 standards without parallel preparations for alternative aircraft, and resolution of the trade disputes that created the political environment for reassessment. The implications of this scenario would be continuity in defense procurement, maintained NATO interoperability, and preservation of the existing Canada-US defense relationship without disruption. However, it would also mean accepting continued dependency on US-controlled software systems and foregoing the industrial benefits that alternative proposals offer. This scenario faces the political challenge of being perceived as capitulation to US pressure, which could be domestically costly for the Carney government given its mandate to reduce Canadian vulnerability to US decisions. The second scenario involves Canada capping F-35 purchases at 16 aircraft and acquiring approximately 40 to 80 Gripen aircraft to complete the fighter replacement requirement. This represents a mixed fleet approach that some defense analysts have proposed. Conditions required include political calculation that diversification reduces risk while maintaining some F-35 capability for high-end missions requiring stealth and advanced sensors. This approach would allow Canada to claim it is honoring its commitment to the F-35 program through the first 16 aircraft while reducing overall dependency and gaining industrial benefits from Gripen production. Early indicators would include negotiations with Saab reaching advanced stages, public statements from Canadian officials about the benefits of fleet diversity, and infrastructure planning that accommodates both aircraft types. The implications would be more complex logistics and training requirements from operating two fighter types, but greater operational flexibility and reduced dependency on a single supplier. NATO partners would likely express concern about interoperability challenges, and the United States would view this as a partial withdrawal from the F-35 partnership. However, Canada would maintain some F-35 capability for integrated operations while gaining greater autonomy over the majority of its fighter fleet. The third scenario involves continued review and delayed decision, with Canada maintaining the status quo of committing only to the first 16 aircraft while postponing a final decision on the remaining 72. This scenario could emerge if the political costs of either full commitment or partial withdrawal are both deemed too high, leading to a decision to postpone the decision. Conditions required include the Canadian government calculating that waiting provides more information about both U.S. policy direction and alternative options, or that domestic political considerations favor avoiding a definitive choice until after the next election cycle. Early indicators would include repeated statements about ongoing reviews without concrete timelines, continued engagement with both Lockheed Martin and Saab without moving to a final decision, and emphasis on the complexity of the decision requiring thorough analysis. The implications would be continued uncertainty for the Royal Canadian Air Force regarding fleet planning, potential delays in the broader CF-18 replacement timeline, and frustration from both the United States and industry partners about the lack of clarity. However, this approach minimizes immediate political risk while preserving future flexibility. Canada's F-35 reassessment reflects the intersection of defense procurement, technological sovereignty, economic pressure, and alliance politics. The confirmed facts show that Canada has committed to 16 F-35 aircraft while actively reviewing the decision regarding the remaining 72 aircraft in the context of deteriorating trade relations with the United States under the Trump administration. The analysis reveals that this situation involves competing considerations: capability and interoperability advantages of the F-35 versus sovereignty and industrial benefits of alternatives, alliance cohesion versus reducing dependency on a politically volatile partner, and immediate operational requirements versus long-term strategic positioning. 3 plausible scenarios exist: proceeding with the full F-35 purchase, adopting a mixed fleet with capped F-35 numbers supplemented by Gripen, or continuing a prolonged review that defers a final decision. Each scenario carries different implications for NATO interoperability, Canada-US defense relations, industrial benefits, and Canadian strategic autonomy. What remains uncertain is how the Canadian government will balance these competing factors and what weight will be assigned to immediate capability requirements versus longer-term concerns about supplier reliability and technological sovereignty. The question of whether modern defense partnerships can withstand significant economic and political friction remains central to how this decision will ultimately be resolved. The outcome will depend on factors still evolving. These include whether US-Canada trade relations stabilize or continue to deteriorate, whether the Trump administration's approach to allies becomes more consistent or remains unpredictable, whether NATO partners apply diplomatic pressure regarding interoperability concerns, and whether Canadian domestic politics shifts the balance between maintaining traditional alliance commitments and pursuing greater strategic independence. We will continue to track confirmed developments as this reassessment progresses. If you have access to official government statements, industry announcements, or credible defense analysis sources regarding this procurement decision, sharing them contributes to more informed understanding of this complex intersection between defense capability, sovereignty, and alliance relationships.